Hello everyone. In today's lecture we will be examining two countries that we haven't covered in much detail yet, Spain and Portugal. This was perhaps an oversight on my part, as until the Napoleonic period both countries continued to hold sway over extensive global empires, especially in the continent of South America. In this lecture we will track Napoleon's invasion of the Iberian Peninsula before moving on to examining the liberation struggles that subsequently occurred in both the Spanish and the Portuguese empires. Spain and Portugal had been the first two European kingdoms to colonize Central and South America. So much wealth, particularly silver and gold, flowed from the Spanish colonies into Europe that it actually crashed the economy, with ideas of inflation not being as understood as they are today. Portugal's colonies in Brazil soon became the country's most important, thanks to the extensive plantation system that was developed there. Spain became by far Europe's strongest state, holding extensive lands from Holland to Italy. Under the so-called Iberian Union, the country even subsumed Portugal and the Portuguese Empire into the Spanish one. A series of defeats in the English Channel, the Netherlands, and in the 30 Years' War, however, did highlight the limits of Spanish power. Following the 30 Years' War, Spain could no longer claim to be the strongest country in Europe, losing this title to France. Portugal, meanwhile, won its independence from Spain, but struggled to retain the prominence that it had once enjoyed. Nonetheless, the 18th century was not just a time of stagnation. Under the new Bourbon dynasty, Spain was invigorated and still controlled a large empire stretching from Colorado to Patagonia. Portugal began its own recovery before being absolutely decimated by the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, which wiped out a third of the Portuguese economy and shackled the country economically to Great Britain. At the same time as Britain was fighting a North American war to retain its colonies, Spain was faced with an uprising of its own to deal with in South America. The heart of this rebellion was Peru, a part of the empire that was increasingly impoverished as wealth became concentrated in the east and the north, today's Argentina and Colombia. Continued mistreatment of native and mestizo or biracial people earned anger towards the Spanish colonial administration, which only increased when the administration imposed taxes on the poor whilst the rich seemingly continued to prosper. An upper-class Andean native who titled himself Tupac Amaru II, after the name of the final Incan emperor, led a rebellion. Tupac Amaru's rebellion was initially successful, attracting the support of hundreds of thousands of native people who were suffering under Spanish rule and encouraged by prophecies heralding the re-emergence of the old Incan Empire. Some of the rebels even claimed to be fighting for the Spanish king and accused the colonial administrators of being traitors to Spain, similar claims to those made in the slave rebellion in San Domingo 10 years later. Fascinatingly, many of the generals and fighters for the native cause were women, in stark contrast to, for example, the army of the 13 colonies. The Spanish managed to defeat the rebels by raising a local army instead of importing men from Europe, as the British had done. Tupac was betrayed and handed over to the Spanish. Forced to watch the execution of his wife, he was then tied to 4 different horses who all pulled in different directions. When these failed to quarter him, he was simply beheaded. The rebellion continued for another year, with violence against civilians increasing as it progressed. Following the victory of the Spanish, native languages and clothing in Peru were banned in an attempt to wipe out Incan history entirely. Society in the Spanish colonies was divided by a rigid and archaic caste system. As well as being split between the white and mestizos, the non-native population of the Spanish colonies were also split between Creoles, born in South America, and Peninsulares, born in Spain. Peninsulares held the most prestigious positions in the colonies, much to the anger of the Creoles. Below the mestizos, meanwhile, were the mulattoes, biracial colonists who could trace their heritage to both white and black ancestors. Then the native people, and finally, on the bottom rung, were black colonists, either slaves or the descendants of slaves. The Spanish Bourbon kings increasingly loosened the restrictions of the caste system in their 18th century reforms. This angered the Creoles, who felt that their privileged position was under threat. The Creoles felt that they were squeezed between the Peninsulares on the one side and the increasingly assertive mestizos and mulattoes on the other. Just like the white elite in San Domingue or in the American South, the Creoles read and consumed Enlightenment ideas coming out of Europe and adopted many of these ideas to their own circumstances. These ideas concerned not only political liberty, but also free trade, with Creoles resenting the control and limits that Spain placed upon the colonial economy. Creoles wanted the colonies to be able to trade with not only Spain's perennial enemy, Great Britain, but also with the United States. These wishes were granted following 1795, when Spain's alliance with France led to the Royal Navy imposing a blockade around Spain. The British Royal Navy, that is. Now, the only effective trade the colonists could conduct was with the United States, and links with Madrid were weakened. The Portuguese colony of Brazil had recently grown rich from the discovery of gold and diamonds. The number of slaves brought from Africa to work in the mines and plantations of Brazil outstripped anywhere else in the world. Whereas 400,000 slaves were brought to North America, over 10 times as many, nearly 5 million, were taken to Brazil. As Portugal fell into bankruptcy following the Lisbon earthquake, Brazil's importance increased. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte's forces crossed Spain in order to conquer Portugal, which was Britain's long-term ally. The Prince of Portugal, Dom João, as well as the highest echelons of the Portuguese nobility, left Portugal via a British naval escort and relocated the capital of the kingdom to Brazil. He instituted widespread reforms, opening up Brazil for trade with the rest of the world, mostly Great Britain, and, in 1915, even declared that Brazil was a kingdom of equal stature to Portugal. Napoleon's invasion, meanwhile, had not gone entirely to plan. Whilst the Portuguese mainland had been conquered by French troops, Spain, a French ally, had revolted against their king Carlos IV and replaced him with his son Fernando. Napoleon, perturbed by these developments, moved his troops into Madrid and other Spanish cities to ensure the stability of the country. When this sparked widespread protest in the so-called 2nd of May uprising, he replaced Fernando with his brother, with Napoleon's brother, that is, Joseph Bonaparte. The Peninsular War then broke out throughout Spain, with the French forces being pitted against a variety of ragtag guerrilla forces in the provinces. Whilst the French were able to win victories in open battle, they were unable to squash opponents entirely. The British, their forces now recovered from the disastrous Caribbean campaigns in the 1790s, landed an army under the Duke of Wellington in Portugal, spreading the war there. The French remained unbeaten in battle, but so many of their men were killed in hit-and-run raids that Napoleon referred to the Iberian Peninsula as an ulcer slowly sapping the strength of his country. The French soldiers responded to their inability to squash Spanish forces with a series of brutal reprisals against Spanish civilians. This only increased the levels of opposition that they faced. The experience of fighting the French greatly increased Spanish national pride, helping to create a joint identity in a country that previously was defined by regionalism. Whereas many middle-class Spaniards and Portuguese originally supported the French, hoping that Napoleon would weaken the power of the Church in the country, the violence directed against their countrymen led them to turn away from the French occupation in increasing numbers. A parliament was formed at Cadiz which formulated a new, fairly liberal constitution for not only Spain but also for the Spanish colonies. Creoles were invited to join the Cadiz parliament, and the colonies of South America were given equal standing to the Spanish kingdom. In the end, the French were driven out of Spain and Fernando was restored to the throne, but at an unbelievable cost. The Peninsular War was twice as bloody as the later Spanish Civil War would be. The war in Spain, the mass violence, and the imprisonment of the Bourbon monarchs left the South American colonies with a large degree of autonomy, and they realized that they could run themselves largely as they wished. This saw the development of autonomous juntas which ruled different colonies. Some colonies, like Mexico, came under the dominance of the Peninsulares, who proclaimed their loyalty to King Fernando. Others, such as the South American city of Santiago, were run by the Creoles. The Creoles declared their opposition to not only the Napoleonic regime in Spain, but also the liberals in the Cadiz parliament, who refused to grant the colonies autonomy and free trade. The Creoles took control of more and more colonies, with opposition to Spain only increasing after Fernando's restoration. Fernando in turn sought a military solution to the conflict, and war subsequently broke out across South America. In the south of the continent, today's Argentina, the revolt was led by José de San Martin. Whilst the local Creoles successfully drove the Spanish out of the province of Rio de la Plata, there subsequently emerged serious tensions between the mercantile powers, who ruled the city of Buenos Aires, and the provinces, who desired more autonomy. These provinces did not want Spanish rule, but they did not want subservience to Buenos Aires either. Paraguay, Bolivia, and Uruguay all split from Buenos Aires, with the latter being ruled for a time by Brazil. Chile was under the control of forces loyal to Spain until San Martin led a daring raid across the Andes, catching the loyalist forces by surprise. His offensive was aided by the Chilean patriot Bernardo O'Higgins, who would become the country's first president. San Martin then attacked Peru, but was unable to penetrate far into this loyalist heartland. In the north of South America, today's Venezuela, loyalist support was stronger due to the attachment of many Creoles to the slave economy and the fear of a slave revolt, as seen in nearby Haiti. Patriots led by Simón Bolívar did declare independence from Spain and waged a bloody "war to the death" in the region. Bolívar's forces, however, were outmaneuvered and outgunned by forces loyal to Spain. In 1815 it seemed that the independence movement was doomed to defeat, as troops flooded into Venezuela from Spain and even attacked the Patriots' home region in the north, New Granada, in today's Colombia. Simón Bolívar, then in exile, wrote his famous Jamaica letter in this period, in which he spoke of the inevitability of liberty and independence. Whilst the Jamaica letter criticized Spain and called for an independent republic, it also called for an authoritarian system of rule and expressed fears of mestizo prominence. Bolívar's unwavering support for the revolution helped ensure that war with Spain continued. Bogotá was captured in 1819 following a remarkable victory which wiped out the Spanish forces in New Granada. Bolívar, now nicknamed the Liberator, was declared president of Gran Colombia, a state comprising today's Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador. Much of these areas were still under loyalist control, but in the course of a 2-year campaign, Venezuela and Colombia were entirely liberated. King Fernando's forces, due to leave for South America from Cadiz, revolted, forcing him to grant liberal reforms and costing him the support of conservatives in the former colonies who now embraced the Patriots' cause. Bolívar then moved his forces south, meeting up with San Martin in Ecuador in 1822. The Northerners were more powerful than the Southerners, and it was they who finally drove the Loyalists out of the Peruvian heartland. By 1824, South America had been entirely liberated. In Mexico, the entrenched Peninsular elite were faced with a populist revolt that broke out following a call for independence by the priest Miguel Hidalgo. Hidalgo's large, mostly peasant army, united under the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, drove towards Mexico City, slaughtering property holders along the way, not only Peninsulares but Creoles too. After Hidalgo's execution, another priest, Morelos, took up the struggle before himself finally being defeated and executed. In the end, it was not the populist rabble that would bring Mexico independence, but its Creole elite, who despised the reforms put forward by King Fernando in 1820. An officer who had defeated the priest revolt declared himself Emperor Augustine I in 1822. His death a year later, ushered in a Mexican republic. As Spanish rule ended throughout the Americas, Portuguese rule also ended in Brazil. Dom João, now king, returned to Lisbon long after the French had left in 1821, as revolts threatened his rule there. He left his son, Dom Pedro, in control of Brazil. The Portuguese Parliament then attempted to repeal many of the reforms and autonomy granted to Brazil and return it to being a client kingdom. Parliament recalled Dom Pedro back to Portugal, but he refused to go and instead declared himself emperor of an independent Brazil. The new state was recognized in 1824. In the space of just 16 years, Iberian rule in South and Central America had ended entirely. Both Spain and Portugal now faced uncertain futures, and during the 19th century were driven by strife and conflict, falling far behind their European neighbours in development.